on the left is another building by Shaw in England, a large country house called Leyswood or Leeswood in Sussex, south of London, dated 1868, when perhaps he was still using more of a mixture of medieval, and it was reproduced in a magazine called The Builder, and it was reproduced from pen and ink drawing. As I said, I've seen copies of The Builder, some of which were in Richardson's office and were very much soiled with graphite smeared and so forth because they were looked at a great deal. But I'll just show you now to get the idea of the composition. It was stone and brick and tile. And here is the house. That was done. Leyswood or Leeswood was built in 1868. Here's a house in New York State, Hyde Park, which is the Hedrick G. Hyde House. And it was designed by Calvert Fox, V-A-U-X, who worked with Olmsted on Central Park design. Obviously the idea, well, it perhaps isn't as English as we might like to think it should be, and the result is that it maybe has a sort of French character. The same way with this one. This is the Marquand House in Newport, Rhode Island of 1875. This was 1870. And the Newport House was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, who, remember, was the first American architect to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. There really isn't any Queen Anne style in France, but I found this house walking toward the station in the city of Beauvais, and there it's so much like this type. Actually, it's suitable that it should be compared with the work of Hunt, because he had lived in France for some years, but he worked, in fact, as an assistant on the building of the Nouveau Louvre. No trace of that here, of course, in either one. But I thought this is so typical of it. It's very characteristic. There were publications which showed this kind of thing, too. Very characteristically French, with an excessively tall roof form. I almost hate to call it a mansard, but I suppose it is. And with the exaggerated verticality in the windows and bay. I don't know who did it or what, but it probably dates from the same period, in the period about the time that Richard Morris Hunt designed that house, the Marquand House, in Newport, Rhode Island. Well, here then is another example of a house that might be in this sort of background work. And this is a house in England, Ascot House, in the country. It's in, I think it's in Bedfordshire. But it was designed for one of the Rothschilds, Leopold de Rothschild, and the architect was George Devey, D-E-V-E-Y. And this is very typically English, a very grand, big country house and rather nicely done. And there is one of the stables. As you see, the half timbering, combination of window form, picturesque, brick, so forth, there. And here is the other side of Leeswood by Shaw. It looks as though we're in the Rocky Mountains, but it's actually just out in the more domestic kind of countryside around England. But that's really what Richardson was, those things were in the Richardson office. And there's drawing, and there's the work comes to Richardson's design. This color is rather bad, but it's too autumnal, but there it is, and the entrance to the Watts Sherman House in Newport. That is a very good house indeed. Now, as I said, that house was done in 74 to 76. And as you probably are well aware, in 1876 we celebrated 100 years of American independence. with a large exposition in Philadelphia, where, of course, the Declaration of Independence had been signed. I'm going to show you some slides of houses that were built at the Centennial, houses which were built to house the British contingent there. The architect was a man named Thomas Harris, and there is a colored print of it. And then the other side is black and white print of the three buildings of the British commissioners. Staff residence, and so British commission staff residence, all three. And notice what they are. They're a mixture of half timber and tile. In this case, it's one tile. They ship it over, and maybe we could read this better. The Centennial International Exposition, the British Executive, commissioners, delegates, residents, and staff office. And this is the commissioners and delegates, residents, the staff quarters. And then you see them in the kind of way in which they were mostly to be seen at that period in these drawings that were reproduced in black and white. That was made in black and white. And they have a typically little quaint corner windows, all kinds of shapes of roof, which you can probably imagine. Chimneys, which are clustered with panels of this silk wood. I wish we had some pictures of the interiors. I don't know whether there are any. I suppose there may be some, but we certainly don't have them here. And I'll just show you individually so you can see just what these things look like. This is one of them. I don't think it's quite in focus, but little bit. And then we go to the others. Now, they were a very appealing group of buildings. They weren't the primary exhibition of the British, but they were the offices. And as architecture, of course, they were important because we didn't have that kind of thing in this country in 1876. This is actually a colonial house, that is an 18th century house in Newport, Rhode Island, that was altered in 1881 by Charles Fallon McKim, 1879. And this is the dining room. I don't have the outside of the house. It was a plain, relatively simple 18th century house. But I particularly like to show you this because this dining room hits at colonial. And you see it's very close to the Queen Anne. It's the start. I don't like to say it started the Colonial Revival, did it? Actually, the Colonial Revival mostly took up with really sort of Palladian Georgian type buildings. And this really goes back to 17th century residence. That style. And it's painted golf green, which was one of the favorite colors of the Queen Anne. And it has these vertical columns, which end in a sort of ornamental jar and so on. But McKim was one of the first people to be interested in this sort of thing. And he and his partners, Stanford White, younger, and Meade, William Rutherford Meade, took walks around New England and looked at colonial design, and they were responsible for the beginning of this. But I think we have to make a division, that this belongs to their Queen Anne phase, and a little later on we get to their true colonial revival. We won't get to that today. This is a house that was Gothic, actually, Gothic revival by Richard Upjohn. And it's called King's Court. And this is the dining room of 1880-81. And it was added by McKim, Meade, and White. And you see it there in two views. Now, there is like this use of paneling and a plate rail, and even a slightly Japanese-like effect is the kind of ceiling pattern, a kind of basketry. But that's not what we would call the Colonial Revival in a decade or two, but actually it's very close to it. But it is Queen Anne, and Mackenzie and White was certainly among the people who did that. And then there are others, like the Isaac Bell House by Mackenzie and White. That's the hall, and this is a view of the exterior. I just said these sort of bamboo-like column posts and shingles, big chimneys, and a sort of free and abandoned kind of treatment of windows, almost anything. And this is the Robert Golet House. These are both in Newport, and both by Mackenzie and White. And this, the Isaac Bell House was 1881-82, and the Robert Golet House is 1882, definitely. There's a detail. Now you see the patterns, but there's shingle patterns in America. I just said, I call that Queen Anne. I've never been enthusiastic about calling anything shingle style or stick style, terms that have a certain application, but not, I think, very broadly useful these days. The best kind of thing. And then there were other architects who did it. It wasn't all just Mackenzie and White, but William Emerson was one of the ones who did this kind of thing. And this is Alexander Cochran House in Pride's Crossing, Massachusetts, of 1881. There's a view of it. And you see, big bays. I think it's that multifaceted bays. And, well, maybe even a touch of that kind of bell-shaped roof form. That's sort of almost Queen Anne, but that's the thing. And this is a house of 1881 by Emerson. And then in Newport, in 1881, you have the casino. And this was the center. Newport was, of course, the center of fashionable residence for people who come for the summer months. And a great many, it had been popular even before the Civil War, and a great many Southerners came up to Newport, could sail up there, and have their summer away from the heat of the Carolinas and Georgia. The casino at Newport by Mackenzie and White was, I think, the first and important building of this kind, and it's still standing, fortunately, whereas some of their other work of this period is gone. And the casino was built, as I said, in 1880-81. This is an elevation drawing, 2 stories. These were shops. With the entranceway you went through, and you could go out in the back. There's a large courtyard, and you see that although it's basically symmetrical, you get the impression of asymmetry by the various gables, and then this kind of woodwork, which is not the pargeting of England, I'm afraid. Now there's the use of little panes above and in both floors, and then for practical shop purposes, big windows, and even for the apartments above, big windows. You don't want to squint through the little pane. Very practical, and that's very 19th century, of course. There's the plan of the building. As you go through the gateway, you have to come into a large court, open which is surrounded by verandas. And there were cafes, refreshments, things to play tennis out beyond, and to do the same. Piazza, this is a good thing to dine out on it. It's in nice weather. And there's an indoor restaurant cafe and the service. And these were offices and shops across the front. And that is the entrance runway to the drive-in to that. Through carriage to get out in the courtyard at the back. That's the plan of the Newport Casino. And I'm sorry, I wish I had better slides, more slides. There's some old photographs, details of it. As you see, a lot of lattice work and spindle turning appears in it. It's all very sophisticated. This is shingles. It's all wood and shingles and spindles. And this is sort of even a kind of Chinese window there on one side. And there's another view of this kind of decorations kind of thing that went on at the Newport Casino. It was certainly an important landmark in the Queen Anne in America, and I suppose that it's now just about the only really first-class Queen Anne building that's left. There's an interior of part of the gallery, and you can imagine ladies and gentlemen taking tea and refreshments on these verandas in the pleasant summer weather of Newport. Well, if fate had been kinder to us, we would have an example of this sort of thing in Oregon. And this is the Portland Hotel. On the left is a drawing from the West Shore magazine in 1883. The Portland Hotel. The person who made it was apparently situated at the top of the Pioneer Post Office. And with this drawing, you can't perhaps always tell what was going to come in the way of material. But it did, however, have a little bit. It had stone things. Brick stucco for the most part, some was stucco. And then a great shingle roof form, and bay windows, and dormer windows, and crusted chimneys. It was very fine. Well, it seems like the Newport Casino. And it comes along just at the time that the Newport Casino was done, as this drawing was published in 1883, and they had begun this just a little before that. Well, as it was built, it was seen somewhat like, that was the way it was supposed to be. And actually, this is more or less the way it was built, but it's a watercolor rendering, which does belong to the School of Architecture and Applied Art. We're very lucky to have that. And it shows that as it presumably was completed, this rendering, built in 1887 to 89, because what happened was that after they started that, the interest of Henry Villard, who was the chief financier behind the whole idea, collapsed, and it's remained unworked on. Only the ground level, the stone, was built. There are some paintings of that in existence showing it just with the ground stone. And here you see a corner of this at the side. This is, I think, this is a remarkable thing. Now, actually, it's a little bit less correct than it really was. And the man who did it, the rendering, I didn't jot it down under the sign, and he was a very good architectural renderer. And they said, one of the older architects that I met in the first thing about it, said they used to get it to give him some drawings, shut him up with a bottle of whiskey that he would do these things. I think that's a good idea, good practice. And but you notice there are certain little things, like the bell-shaped turrets over there on the left side, he just simplified. I don't blame him. Not always easy to draw that in perspective. And here is a photograph taken from Marion Frank in the years near the pond. It was going to come down, and you see, of course, that it did have the bell shape. It didn't. And it was top, and this is a combination of rough brick and stucco. I saw it, in fact, I even stayed in it once. And it was still operating when I came to Orleans. But alas, it was soon torn down, and it was made into a parking lot for the patrons of Marion Frank, basically. And then, of course, more recently, the parking lot disappeared and became what is known as Pioneer Square Plaza. I regret the loss of that very much because it did last a long time, and it really is too bad that it didn't actually stay longer. Now, out of the Western trip, well, McKim came out here with Henry Villard, and he had William Whidden along, who was the clerk of the works. And when the thing was abandoned in Portland, he went back to Boston. And when later it was financed locally to finish the Portland Hotel. They asked Woodburn to come out. I suppose they asked Mackenzie, but they were too. They had moved by that time into the American Renaissance, and they were far beyond the Queen Anne. But anyway, Woodburn brought his friend Ian Lewis with him, and they formed a very important practice when they completed the hotel in 1887-89. But, as I understand it, this hotel was actually built in the early 80s from the design of Mackenzie and his wife. It was the Tacoma Hotel in Tacoma, and it lasted quite a while, but it burned. And I never saw it, but it burned sometime before my time, actually. But there it was, and you see the verandas, the bell-shaped, let me have a bell-shaped cupola if possible, grouped windows. It must have been very attractive. I think it was really too bad that these two pieces, which were both actually very significant, would disappear completely. Well, now the Queen Anne is perhaps the most extraordinary kind of architecture you can imagine, and obviously there would be no way to find a precedent for a building of this kind back in the days of good Queen Anne. No. Been horrified by it, I expect. But at any rate, it is to illustrate the extremes to which the Queen Anne style can be developed. It's the Carson House in Eureka, California, just over the border, really, from Oregon. It's now the Ingomar Club, and it's really a fantasy. The man who built it was a lumberman, and he put all kinds of lumber in it, and the lumber is in all kinds of shapes, as you can see. But it's really most remarkable. And it's been pretty well, it is well preserved, there isn't any doubt about it. Across the street from it is what is called the smaller Carson House. Now that, you see, is pretty much the kind of thing that a Queen Anne building house would be, and these date from the 1880s and 89. The main Carson House dates from about 1884, and this smaller one dates from, I believe, about 1889. And it isn't painted up quite so lavishly, but it's very nicely painted. Perhaps it wasn't actually quite so pastel-like in its original state. Now, they were attributed to an architect named Newsom, Joseph C. Newsom and Samuel Newsom, who were architects practicing in the San Francisco area. And the Newsoms published a book, which there's a better color of the smaller Carson House, you see, of designs, without specifically calling it Queen Anne. Some of their designs are mentioned as Queen Anne. And so I'm going to show you some of those designs in a minute. This is the smaller Carson House, and we'll just look at one other down there in that area. There's a house in Ferndale, which is just south of Eureka. And it's the same kind of thing. It's not, I don't think it's quite as good, you know, but it's a pretty nice house. It's been dated about 1894, or perhaps earlier. These are about the beginning of the 90s, all of these. The Newsoms were a family of builders, architects, and one of them, named J. Cather Newsom, published a book entitled Modern Homes of California. It has no date, but it undoubtedly dates from the 1890s. I'm going to go rather quickly through some of those examples because they do show the range of form, and also, in some cases, because he identifies them stylistically as Queen Anne. Although not necessarily. He's not very accurate on it, even according to the looseness that Queen Anne allows. This is the first one I'll show you. It's called Escondido, and it was in, it gives a location for it. It said it was located at 18th and Filbert in Oakland. A good many of the houses were located in Oakland, and perhaps that's where they were settled. He is not apparently the one who did the actual Carson House, but the family of architects named Newson. We notice that they like to have round bays and polygonal bays mixed up, and rather spindly sort of columns, well, with a very picturesque kind of treatment for windows. And here is another one. Now this gets to look a little bit more like those buildings at the Philadelphia Centennial. And this one he called Farallone. Well, if you read the present day papers, even like the Register Guard, and their section where they have designs for houses and so forth, published usually on Sunday, you will see that the people who put those things together, and I hate to call them architects, give them names that mean really nothing at all to the relation of the design. And they didn't do it in the 90s, and they don't do it now. But this had a subtitle, Farallone, and was in Berkeley. And it was called, he did call this the Queen Anne style. And sure enough, it looks like the buildings at the English Commissioners' buildings at the Centennial in Philadelphia. And there we go on, because there's no point in taking too much time on these just to get the picture of them. This is called Oak Street, in the characteristic Oakland style. Well, take it or leave it, that's it. It was on Oak Street in Oakland, so it's got a lot of oak about it. And that is really about typical. It's not as much Queen Anne as that. What does it say here? It's another design. As you see, big projecting gables, shingled, and all kinds of quaint bays, little windows coming out. And the general tendency of the Queen Anne is to be rather vertical, and perhaps to have a kind of top-heavy effect, which it really didn't have in England, or in the best examples even, in the United States. And then there's one called Etna Springs. And on some of these steep sites, they get very difficult. This is at Vernon Heights in Oakland. And this is really typical of the Oakland, California siting. And here's another one. Now this one is actually rather more like what we'd say generalized Queen Anne. This is called Pacific Heights. And I hope I haven't skipped up on these. Got this. Here is a drawing of a couple more, which is Linda Vista, and it's in Linda Vista Terrace in Oakland. The thing is called it Modernized Colonial, and it is an El Dorado. Well, look at them. They're all now. You can look around Eugene, and you can find some houses that follow this general configuration that are still standing today. They may not have all their original features there, but they have the general character of it. And now let's look at the Oregon examples, turning from this the Newsom book, so that we can see what it's really like. And I show you mostly the bigger examples rather than the smaller ones. I would hardly know where to start and where to stop with the smaller one. The house on the left and the house on the right are two very good examples of the Queen Anne. Both of them are in Astoria. The one on the left is the Benjamin Young House, dated 1883, and the one on the right is the best known house in Astoria. It's called the Captain Flavel House of 1883-84. And it's now opened as a kind of house museum. I really said, really, the features that we've seen, it comes pretty close to being as extravagant as the Carson House in Eureka, but of course it isn't quite. And it's true that the house on the left is perhaps more correctly Queen Anne than this one. Sometimes I wonder if we really don't need another term for some of these houses. I don't know what to call them. They are not stick style, they're not shingle style, they're certainly not Colonial Revival, which you'll see was fairly academic. And the fact is that they are very free, and that was the whole virtue of the Queen Anne revival, which didn't revive anything, and had a combination of various patterns of woodwork, various skinny posts, and very frequently a sort of bell-shaped top to one of these corner turrets. And a lot of spindle work comes into it, but it's very difficult. Well, those are good examples. Astoria has a number of other houses that fall within this general category, but those are the only two I'll show you. Now here is Eugene's example of the Queen Anne style. We have some others, but this is obviously the best example of the Queen Anne style, and the Murphy House. Obviously, there's Shelton Murphy, and Dr. Murphy, residence of Dr. Shelton. And it's nice to see it in a print because you don't have interference with too much landscaping. And, of course, the railway comes along in here, but in a drawing, you don't have to put all those things in. You can forget it. And it's out there. But you see how it has characteristics like the Flavel house. And hopefully it will last. But Eugene is a very difficult place to have any old buildings and have them kept. It's the same way with getting rid of trees. There's a view looking across the foliage at it. It is, of course, as you know, quite a remarkable house. And Dr. Johnson left it to the county, I believe, and the county doesn't know quite whether to give it to the city or not. I can't get into all of that, but that's a really problematical sort of thing. But that's the kind of thing, and it was built in 1888, and the man who did it, the architect, was W.D. Pugh, P-U-G-H. So here are some other views of it, including a plan, bays of all kinds of shapes, I should point it out as a Richardsonian Romanesque, that many of the rooms sort of bulge out like a balloon, like bubble gum coming out of the corner of the mouth. And they have irregular relationship to the main body. But they're not precisely the interesting study to study the way in which bays are related to the main body, right through from the simple bays of the early 19th century on up toward those things, as you see it here. But that's the kind of thing it is. And this is the house in Woodburn, which is very similar, the Settlemeyer House in Woodburn, and it is dated 1889. A man named Edward T. Root is supposed to have been the designer of it. I show you a general view, and on the other side, a detail of the chimney. Now that is one of the peculiarities that the Queen Anne in America liked to use. A rather ornamental chimney, and a chimney which has a window inserted in it, so the flue has to be divided around it. So they were fond of it. I wonder about the psychology why, but it appears in quite a number of examples, including designs that were published by Georgia Barber, whose work we're going to come to. I don't think this is by Barber, but this is the design that's related. And you see the large verandas, and notice the glitter patterned shingles all around over it. And it's patterned in the brickwork of the chimney. And I suppose this is really stucco up there. And it looks as though perhaps a painting of the famous sunflower of the Queen Anne and the aesthetic movement in England. Very good. I think it is most interesting structure in Woodburn. Now, here is a design from a book published by a man named Palliser, and this book is called Modern Cottages. In fact, they frequently think of these as cottages, though they are not really very small. Most of them are really quite large. And this one shows the front and side elevations of this design. And it isn't as grand as the Settlemeyer House, but similar. Has a tower, square, has different patterns of shingle, has a little semblance of half timbering, and has some of these rather spindly porch supports, and of course, a paneled chimney. Well, there is a house, which you're seeing here, which is strikingly like it, and must have been from a Palliser design, but modified. This is the Chaviner House of 1874, and that is received in Gold Hill in Oregon. That date is perhaps too early. I put the date in, but I think it really is too early. And then you see we have the Palliser House plan over here. This is the Palliser plan. You get an idea of the character of the arrangement. They're not regular enough, so that's it. I didn't see this porch around the corner, stairway going up, and as you can see, the second floor plan here, where the first floor plan I just didn't bring in, I guess. And this is then an attic, and there's a tower room up there. And a lot of them did have those tower rooms, which must have been very nice for children to play in and to hide away in. This is the Gold Hill Chaviner. Here is a house in Fort, well, I guess this is the same one, the Chaviner House again in Gold Hill. And here is a house in Port Orford, and that one is shingle, and that is similar in general form to the Palliser design. I doubt if it's actually based on a specific design, but these things were generally picked up and made over by local builders. Well, perhaps the masterpiece of this whole movement of these large Queen Anne houses is in Jacksonville, and it is what used to be called the Jerry Noonan House. It's been passed through other hands, of course. It was built in 1891, and it comes quite specifically because we know it was mentioned in the publication of a book called The Cottage Souvenir, no cottage again, by a man named George F. Barber of Knoxville, Tennessee. And his book went through several editions, and he mentions the fact that one of his houses was built in Jacksonville, and here is his design, and this I think is an edition of 1892, so it was after that. In this case, the plans were actually sold, and local builders could do it, and they say, this house was erected from our plans at Taylorville, Illinois, and Jacksonville, Oregon. This particular design. As you see, it has a veranda around one corner, and this little shaped roof, gable roof, turret roof at the corner, various kinds of little balcony up there, kind of half timbering effect up in the upper part, and then a remarkable chimney, corner chimney, with a big window, not exactly over the chimney, but just beside it, as you can see. A remarkable house, and quite reasonably well preserved, to tell you the truth. Or it's really very typical. Well, fortunately, one can see some of the details in the photographs we have, and also I could show you some of the other houses made from Barber's design. It's a very dark slide, I'm sorry to say, but it is a design. This is the one, in fact, in Taylorville, Illinois, from the same design, taken by Christopher Owens in the winter, and it's almost impossible to see it, so don't worry about it, but it is the same design. And here is the same design in better light, of course, but you can see it's always the same design, and Christopher Owens took this photograph for us too, and this is in Iowa City, Iowa, and it is a house, it's the Barber House, the same one that they had in Jacksonville and Taylorville, Illinois, and now in Iowa City, Iowa. Well, that isn't the end of it, because here is a very nice house in a very good section of town. This is on Audubon Place, and it is in New Orleans, and it is obviously the Barber design. It has been mirrored in plan, but otherwise very similar. And it's all timber, doesn't have brick, but it has a big stone chimney. It has similarly shaped veranda, and there's the window in the chimney peak. I used to reverse the slide so you would see the design is the same, but I didn't. I think you're all pretty smart. You can reverse it in your own mind. That is in Ottoman Place, not very far from Tulane. It's a private street marked with a gateway, and it has a lot of interesting houses of the late 19th and early 20th century, but as far as I know, having walked through it, this is the only one that comes into this particular mode, this Queen Anne style, and it is clearly one of George F. Barber's designs. But we can come back to Oregon, because there are some more of his houses scattered around in Oregon, and probably more than I can show you. There is the detail of the Jacksonville house. Just brought it back to show you the famous window in the chimney. Now this one on the right here is a house in Drain, Oregon. It is the Charles Drain house, and it is dated about 1895, and it is actually based on another design, but comes from one of the Barber books. I didn't see here a detail of it, just looking at it. There are several Drain houses in Drain, and this one is the Charles Drain house. But the next one is going to be the Passat House, which is also in Drain, and it's another design by Barber. This book was very popular. I don't know whether any copies of the book can be traced in Oregon now, in library or something. But I have seen the book, a couple of editions of it, and I know that that's exactly where the kind of design comes. And they're offered. You see, Mr. Barber would offer a kind of summary plan design and specifications, and then local builders could construct it from that. They didn't have the imagination or the interest to make it any different. This one now is in Roseburg, and is the Napoleon Rice house, built in 1893. The architect is said to have been a man named Perkins, J.A. Perkins, and it is a similar Barber-like design. I believe it is also by Barber, as you see it here. There's another view of it, looking at it from an angle. It's a little bit less grand, and it's really rather thin. Not only the chimney is thinner, but even the porch column and so forth are thinner. It's a little bit more spindly. This is also in Roseburg, and this is the Hamilton, Hamilton House of 1895, and the J.W. Hamilton House of 1895. Similar. Notice they like to have round bays, round towers, and conical roof. The most spectacular house of this kind in Roseburg is, of course, this one. Hard to photograph because when you look at it from a distance, you get a lot of foliage, and when you get close, you can't see it all. This is the Rosa Parrott House, and that was built presumably in the 90s too. I don't have the exact date. That's very typical. A really very nice house, large house. As I said, one of the major features of Roseburg. This is a close-up view looking up at the porch from nearby, and it doesn't give you the same really dramatic effect that you get from a distance as you look across the valley at it. One of the best examples of this is a house called Deepwood, which is in Salem, and which is well known and is now a house museum. Deepwood was built in 1894, and this is a view. It's quite a complex house, and again a lot of foliage, hard to see it. A porch comes out at an angle on the corner, and this is the tower at one side, a kind of bell-shaped roof. Stone base, the rest of it is wood. And here's another view, much the same, but when the foliage is out, it's different weather.
it's just impossible, in my opinion, to get an overall view that illustrates really the way in which this house is built. That's another view of it. I think that projecting veranda, which sort of covers a porte cochere, was probably enclosed somewhat later, and not that when it was built in the 90s. The grounds are rather important, as they were landscaped by those ladies who were the best known landscape architects of the early part of this century, Lord and Schreiber. And then, I'm not going to show you the land. The gardens are rather well preserved. This is the stable, later garage. And it is a good, the little Queen Anne brought down right to it. To here. That is at Deepwood, which is, of course, it's in the other end of the block, which has bush pasture on the farther end, on the western end, and has the bush house, which we've seen before. And another view of Deepwood. This one is a house in, somebody asked about a house in Coquille. This is a house in Coquille, built in 1901, however, and it's designed by Barber. It's called the Sherwood House, and later called the Barney House, I believe. There's another photograph. So you can see it here. Well, maybe I got that one out of order. Let me go back to this. This is it. I just said this one belonged with the last one, and this typical. It is really a Barber design, obviously. Here is a row of houses in Portland. This row is an example of the kind of thing that was occasionally built, and it is Queen Anne, and they're called now the Camel Town houses. I think that may be a modern name. This is another view of one of the big Queen Anne houses. I think I must have gotten these slipped up to make sure that's an important example. And that dates from, when did I have that here? 1893, by a man named Camel. This is the house of an architect named Henry Hefty. And he was the one who was the architect for, in fact, that's the Calkins house on Patterson and 11th, recently restored, dating from 1901, 1902, and I don't know the architect. This is, well, I'll get back to this one, I think that's right. This is a house in Portland this is called the Jackson House. One of my former students took the picture, and I don't even have the exact location of it, but as you can see, it's got a typical tower. But this is interesting. This was a drawing reproduced in a periodical of the time. This was from, not exactly a periodical, but a specialized publication called the Oregonian Souvenir, published in 1892. And it was the house of Henry J. Hefty in the holiday edition. And Henry Hefty was the architect for the first Congregational Church, which, as you saw not very long ago, was dated 1891. So this house was probably built just about the same time. And it says it's doing a house that, while it may have some slight connection to the Romanesque, it's basically what is said, it's Queen Anne. And this one, I think, is gone. This is a photograph from the Oregonian Souvenir, that wonderful publication of 1892. This was the house of Mr. C.M. Forbes. It had to be built by 1892, obviously, 1891. Completed that right. And it's one of the more extravagant examples of Queen Anne, including a little, it's hard to imagine how you would put any other elements in it. And look, we have combined here a big square window frame with a Gothic window, and then parchment foil. And then up here, we get all kinds of different things, pointed arch form, segmental arch form, all kinds of like lattice work. It looks as though it made of, cloth, like pastels, but it's all wood, of course. And it's one of these little round towers going up there to a conical roof. I don't know exactly where it was. It's identified as the site of it in Portland. But it obviously did exist, as the photograph shows you that it was vacant and published in the Oregonian Souvenir in 1892. Now, I like this house for the same purpose. And this is, I don't know who did this one. This is, I simply call it a domed house. I can tell you the address of this one since I took the photograph myself. It's 2117 Northeast 15th Avenue. And it stands in it's a fairly modest houses. I suppose you could call them simpler Queen Anne, but this is a really remarkable example with a round sort of sugar pot affair. But it does look as though you could take the lid off, reach in, and that's the kind of thing that people rather tend to get into, you know. And then they have this broken shaped roof, like a gambrel roof, and window forms, just some segmental window, and then a bolting back, and of course some of these. There tends to be a sort of furniture-like character about much of the detail. It looks like the kind of detailing that you'd expect in what is generally called Jacobean furniture. The table, big Jacobean table legs, are used for porch posts. It is typical of this kind of Queen Anne. Well, that may be, in fact, about enough of the Queen Anne, but for a couple, some miscellaneous buildings will follow. The houses are the most extreme and perhaps the most interesting to us today, and especially as many of these other buildings simply don't exist. And they were, however, popular and they were modern. This was the Mechanics' Fair, the 5th annual exhibition in Portland in 1883, and the other print of it showing the interior come from that magazine that provides so much information about the architecture as well as other things of the period, the West Shore. It was a wooden building, didn't last, but there it is. And this is out of focus. Maybe it can be gotten into focus. I don't know. Can you focus? Yeah, I think, yeah, that's better. Anyway, it's a mixture of form, and that is typically Queen Anne. It is, because it was intended to be an exhibition hall, it's relatively simple, and it has most of its elaboration is on the front, but obviously the rest of it is a warehouse. And then there's 2 little towers, a little bit like Dean Hall. It's called the Pavilion. And this is Mr. Honeymoon and Mr. Walden. And they're not architects. They were obviously sponsors and entrepreneurs in the development of this fair. The 5th annual exhibition of the Mechanics' Fair. But here is another building that I think may have replaced it. This is the building of 1888, and it was the North Pacific Industrial Exposition Building in Portland. And it looks like a combination of Queen Anne sections. This is sort of like the central point. And then it is these bays, but they're not identical. They tended to avoid symmetry even when the essential elements are symmetrically arranged. And it has something that's probably meant to be hard something, but maybe carved in wood. And I don't know how long that lasts, but it's long since gone. But that is the way most of the buildings would look were in the Queen Anne mode. And I don't know that we can't get as enthusiastic. I guess we're not as interested as in some of the other things. This is the Failing building, as it is, well, it's marginally Queen Anne. And it has also some little hint of what was to come in the Colonial Revival, particularly in the treatment of the frieze with those garlands at the top in Portland. This is the way it used to look before it was repainted. Maybe shows up the character of the building a little better. Not a very distinguished building, but it is still there. This is a building of, well, I was thinking about it again, and I thought, well, I don't know that I really should have put it in here as a Queen Anne building. It has some features, but it's also got some Second Empire features too, though it does not have a mansard roof. And this is not in Oregon, but it's by an Oregon architect. This is the Bank of British Columbia, which is still standing, and it was built by Warren H. Williams in 1886. So this is it there. Quite an interesting building, and this man was the architect for Beatty Hall. Well, here's another, this is perhaps more suitably Queen Anne, gone, of course. Also designed, however, by Williams and Williams, that he and his son worked in it, in 1890. The Hibernian block in Portland, it was at either 5th or 6th and Washington Street, but it was in downtown. And then it looked sort of like a school. There were schools, and I forgot to mention, I think the last time, that in the English Queen Anne, in the London area especially, there were a lot of public schools, as we were called. They're not the private schools of England, that kind of public school, but they're regular schools. It's a brick, perhaps a little stone, shops below, meeting hall above. Still some suggestion, of course, of the Romanesque. You can't separate all these things completely, but I put them into the categories that seem most suitable for them. This is the Perkins Hotel, which lasted until my time in Oregon. It was dated, as you see on the facade, 1890. Maybe you can't see it, but it was dated 1890 on the facade. And it was said to be a very popular hotel in the 90s and the beginning of this century. This is St. Helens Hall. This is the second group of buildings, built in 1890-91, and the architect was Henry Hefty. So we saw the earlier one, which was Second Empire, and of course the later one, which is more correct phase period. But this is typical. And this is the stone base, brick above. Very interesting sort of cupolas here and there. And the interiors were also Queen Anne like. I don't think anything is left of that after it was rebuilt. And it was, of course, the popular girls' school in Portland. It still is a school for many years. This is the interior of the lobby of St. Helens Hall of that period, with open arcade separating part of the hall from another, and with the stairs leading up around the side, as you can see in that typical Queen. That is typically Queen Anne. The one church that I know about in Portland, and I think maybe there may have been others, but not very common, is this one, which was the first Methodist church, the first Methodist church of 1889. It's gone now. It stood on the corner of 12th and Taylor. 12th Avenue had a great many churches, and still on 12th Street there, or 12th Avenue there are some, including the first Presbyterian church, which is to the north of this, down the street. Now this is really it's a pretty good idea what Queen Anne was meant to be in a church, or what it could be. As it said, stone and wood and shingles and siding and various kinds of roof forms, as you can see. What a very nice building. Too bad it's gone. Here is that photograph of a print which shows you some churches in Portland about that time, and it shows you the range of design. And here it's called Grace Methodist Church there, but that's it. And it shows, this view shows better the whole characteristic of the Queen Anne type. And this is Trinity Church, Gothic, and there's our synagogue, a mixture, and this is one I think we've gone covered that first congregational. Interestingly enough, the new congregational church didn't get into this. It's just before that. And we have the first Presbyterian over here. And this is St. David, and up there is St. Patrick, which is a kind of Renaissance design. Renaissance revival, really, up there. And I think I did show you that, or maybe I didn't. I'm losing my mind lately. Too many things. But these churches belong to the period, all of it, this thing came out before the first congregational church was built, or completed at any rate. Here we had one Queen Anne church in Eugene. And it was the Lutheran Church, Grace Lutheran Church, the 11th and Ferry. Very attractive church, and the only church in Eugene that I know of that had a nice, elegant spire rising up there. And of course, that spire got knocked off in the famous Columbus Day storm of 1962. The interior of it was quite nice. It was like all these Protestant churches, really a preaching hall, and it had a sort of stumpy cruciform shape. The interior was all lined with varnished wood, and very nice. And it was in its later phases, it was painted purple, and known as the Purple Church, and it was an interior design shop. George Eliot had his design shop there, and it's very suitable for that, believe it or not. But it's too bad to have lost it. There was, I believe, a church that I remember vaguely seeing, passing, in Junction City that was very much like this, and may have been the same design. And this may have been that. It's too bad that it is gone, but now gone forever. There's a little entryway in the corner. As you see, a little spindly little column pattern. It's very definitely a sort of Queen Anne church. I showed it to you when it was perfect. I still had before the storm took its tower off. And here's another view of it. Not exactly a fortunate color for a church, but perhaps it was suitable for an interior studio. And I think we've come practically to the end of the Queen Anne. I thought maybe I would show you one or two buildings of this amorphous kind of thing called the stick style. I don't like the use of that term myself, and I don't really want to stress it. But there on the left is a design for a house of 1886 in Bridgeport, Connecticut, print, and
said that it could be built for $1,800. Of course, that was a lot of money then, but it still was an inexpensive house, and that's what I think is important to know. Now, in 1882, the house that is most lavishly like a stick-style house would be the Richard Knapp House in Portland, which occupied a block, and which is a West Shore view of it here, and which unhappily, although it lasted a long time, unhappily was demolished early in the second half of the 20th century. What is said there is the Knapp House, seen view. It had all the sort of wooden, spindly characteristics that any stick house could possibly, stick-style house could possibly expect. I don't think I ever saw the thing completely. Some of the pieces of it, especially the interior of it, were saved and are incorporated in other buildings, including some of the woodwork was put into the Morris Marks house. And I think some of it maybe got up there to the Colony in that group of buildings. But it was great. It was too bad to lose it because it was obviously a masterpiece. It was a bad photograph of the time, but it's the only colored one we have. Perhaps some of you people may have taken it, although most of you weren't alive, I suppose, when this house came down. Now, this is another house that's here in a drawing from the West Shore magazine. And the Knapp House was built in 1882, and this house was built in 1888. And this, I think, I would normally call Queen Anne. Maybe not so much. I would call that one too, you know. But I just show it because possibly you would like to call it a stick style. You could have that one from me as a stick style house. This is the George H. Williams house, which you see there in the print. Obviously more typically Queen Anne. And then it used to have a little stick-style house very close to where we are. This little house stood on the corner of, well, maybe I've got this mixed up. There are two houses, and I might have put them in the wrong way. Yeah, this is the one I want to show you first. This stood on the corner of 11th and Ferry. And the owner was probably the builder, John F. White. Said to have been built in 1877. And this is the house in Albany, which may still be standing, though the Eugene House, this Albany House, the corner of Montgomery and 4th, and it's perhaps standing. I took this picture some time ago. The other one is gone, and we just have some detail. This is the detail of the Albany House, which is this really is the way in which you think people who think about stick style like to think of it, that is patterning boards, making a kind of lattice over the background as you see it there. Both are charming houses, and one would like to see them kept. And this group I took, not very good slide, I'm afraid. I took it in 1955 in December, and it was built about 1890, I suppose, a group of row houses on Southwest Broadway, in the 1500 block on Southwest Broadway. That perhaps could qualify for stick style. There'd be a lot of stick here. And that's all gone. What's away? But look, well, I just assume call it Queen Anne. But maybe because it has so many little angular things, you can call it stick style. And here next to it, you see, is sort of an Italian house of somewhat older date, quite obviously. This would be an Italian house. But that's all I'm going to put in, I think, for any hint of the stick style. And you have to do that for yourself. Now, I think we'll start, although I don't have much time left, with the next group. We're going to switch machines, I believe. But we might as well start with the next group, which will be the American Renaissance. Now, we're leaving something which always has sort of naive and amateur air, even in the most elaborate examples of the Queen Anne, in America, anyway. But we're coming into something
which is sophisticated. And that is what made a great change in the whole. It is something which is more sophisticated than anything that had preceded it in the 19th century, including the Richardsonian Romanesque. And it was the creation, by and large, of McKim, Mead, and White. And this is the, this is their first building that could be claimed to be the American Renaissance. And it's always referred to as that. Very well done. It is the Boston Public Library. And it was lavishly provided with art inside and out. It has a lovely courtyard based on the Palazzo Cancellaria in Rome. And as the facade is based, one shouldn't stress these things, but nearly everybody probably does realize that it goes somewhat back toward the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris, and then goes on back to that, to a building by, oh my God, I can't think of his name, Alberti in 15th century Rimini. But it's unusual, and it combined sophisticated architecture, not copying anything, but it is thoroughly correct. This is the best view, thoroughly correct. And inside it had a wonderful, great reading room across the front. It faces on Copley Square. And that has a tile vault of Guastavina tile, which is one of the inventions that was brought to America by a man named Guastavina, and it really is a form of vaulting practiced in Catalonia, in Spain, even from the Middle Ages on. And that is a great example of sophistication. It also had paintings by Abbey and Sargent, and Puvis de Chavannes, and sculpture by Augustus St. Gaudens. It's the ideal of this sort of thing. Well, we get very quickly into Oregon by looking at the Boston Public Library, which was completed in 1888, it's certainly designed by 1888, and we come to Portland, to what was the Portland Library, the Multnomah County Library, of 1890 to 92. And it was the design of Whidden and Lewis. Well, who else could have done it? They had worked with McKim, Mead, and White. So this is the Boston Public, just to show you. Whidden and Lewis designed a small, very small, compared to the Boston Public Library, a very large library, in fact. And as you see, there it is in a rendering of the period when it was built in 1890 to 92 by Whidden and Lewis. So it's a kind of nice thing to have. But it couldn't exist without the Boston Public Library. But it's also, of course, quite a bit simpler and more economical. We have a few old photographs of it that I had slides of. Not very good. But I must have gotten two on the wrong side. There should be another one of it. That's one end of it. Yeah, there's another one, and they're all dark and not very intelligible. The drawing to go back is the thing that shows us best what it looked like. It's gone. And it was the thing, however, that introduced the American Renaissance to Oregon. Nothing is earlier. And the same architects who did that, of course, did this building, which is coming up here on the right in another rendering by the series of renderings, which are, I think they're still on view in our library upstairs. Anyway, they belong to us, the school. And this is the City Hall, the Portland City Hall, Whidden and Lewis. It was never provided with a tower. It was built in 1895, and since the loss of the library is gone, it's probably the best example of the first impact of the American Renaissance that we have. Really a remarkably handsome building. I don't think the tower was perhaps particularly suited to the rest of the building, and so maybe it's not such a great loss. But obviously a city hall might be expected to have a tower. And here, every aspect of it is worth looking at. This is the west facade, the west side in the drawing, the west side in the photograph, and as you see, it is Renaissance. It doesn't copy any one particular building but it uses the parts of the Renaissance design with great sophistication. Some parts of it are decidedly narrow. It's like the block of the square section of the column shaft. And this is loggia at the top. A very relatively simple restraint across the front. It's not, well, it's only 3 stories high, and it's on a sloping ground, so there is another story on the east side. And you'll see that in the photograph that I was going to show you in just a minute. But I think it is now the finest of these buildings. There's the east side in the rendering. And it has a bulge coming out there, the council chamber. And underneath, an open sort of loggia supported on columns. Right. Well, there's the end of the building. And I think I must have the other side here. This is the east side photograph with its bulging point. A very sophisticated rustication. And then this loggia porch underneath, supported on column. And up at the top, the whole thing is crowned with a balustrade. On the end of the building, and on both ends, but this is the south end, which gets better light, there are some other interesting features. For one thing, this seems to be very correct, but it's got this curious frame of molding going around that roof sliver. And that perhaps looks a little bit like an architect with the Chicago School or something. And then up here, there are these medallions, and again, it's decidedly mannered. The shield-shaped affair with an oval. And there's a symptom. I think they like these features, that was very much indeed, as you said, shows you how original within the idea of sort of correctness, Renaissance, these buildings may be. I'll show you one more, maybe, past building. This is the City Hall. And then we're probably going to quit for today. This is another government building. And of course, it would be the government buildings that are perhaps particularly characteristic of the American Renaissance. This is the Custom House of 1898 to 1901. And the official architect was James Knox Taylor, who was the supervising architect of the Treasury from 1897 to 1912. The local supervisor, however, was Edgar M. Lazar, and he was to do this kind of thing on his own. This is in north part of Portland, northwest, and Custom House. And once again, in these examples, there's often quite a suggestion of sort of reliance on the Renaissance. Most of the 16th century, rather than the 15th century. These patterned coins around the windows. Nice brickwork, very smooth stone brick, terracotta. And this is a loading dock here. This is really the back side. It's on the east side, but there's the back side, and I think we have a view of the other side. Well, that's a part of the end of it where it piles up, on a major map. And here is the west side, which has an open arcade with no roof on it, and that's the main entrance on this side. Really, one of the better buildings, still standing and still in use in Portland. This is the building on the right, is the county courthouse of Clapton County, and it is dated 1904. And the architect for this was Edgar Lazar. Now, he'd been the supervising architect for the Customs House in Portland. It's quite restrained, dignified, and simple, with the basement, 2 stories, and again, no visible. Now, you notice how different the whole effect is from the Queen Anne, where everything is moving about and about to explode. And in the American Renaissance, it's all very serene. At the end, on the other side, is another slide jail in Astoria, which I think is by Lazarus, though I never proved that in any case. It's close to the courthouse, as it should be, and it's a really a good idea to see. This is the corner of the courthouse, the county jail. It's the former Carnegie Library, and there was Carnegie Library here, of course, but most of them were just simple buildings, and this one has a little bit more elaboration, a little bit more classical detail, and it is still standing. And
Among other things, you have this building, the Federal Building at Post Office, which is in Portland, and was done in 1910. And the architect officially was Louis Hobart, who was the supervising architect of the Treasury Department at that time. But there was undoubtedly some local architect. The design presumably came out of the Washington office of the supervising architect of the Treasury Department. Rather strikingly similar in some ways, and again, not remarkably exciting, not very good. This is somewhat more interesting. And this is the Supreme Court building in Salem, and it was designed by William C. Knighton, K-N-I-G-H-T-O-N, who was an architect of rather more interest than one knows. That he one time had a student who was working on him, but he gave up the cause, and I suppose it's open for anybody to take it up now. The Supreme Court building is still the Supreme Court. There was a movement about 20 years ago to discard it in favor of another building to terminate the mall at the north end leading from the Capitol. Fortunately, the Supreme Court didn't have enough wisdom to decide to keep their old building and not to move, which is a very good idea. It is, of course, one of the cream-colored terracotta buildings, which are so typical of this period. The interiors are handsome too. On the whole, I have not gone into interiors in this course, partly because we never would get through if I did. And here is Knighton's work on our campus. And it's our one example of an American Renaissance in this style of architecture here on the Oregon campus. Knighton was for a time the state architect. And during that period that he designed the building called Johnson Hall in 1914 to 15. It was after that Ellis Lawrence, who had started the school, was the head of it in 1914, took over, and he was not the state architect, but university architect, and for a long time, well, I guess up to his death, really, all of the buildings on the campus were designed by Ellis Lawrence and his partners. And so this is the last sort of pre-Lawrence building. There it is from the back, the north side with its portico and Roman architecture, and the back side too. Actually, the awnings rather cheer it up, it's not better than other ones. This is an example of a courthouse in the American Renaissance style. It is the Wasp County Courthouse. It's the third courthouse. And you saw the first one has been restored, and it's a little wooden structure. The second one is still standing, and it's an Italianate institutional kind of building, very much like Jacksonville of the 80s. This building dates from 1912 to 14, and the architect was a man named C.J. Quandell. This is the facade. It's a curiosity somewhat in Wasco County that they have all three courthouses that they ever had, whereas most places they tore them down to replace them with another one on the site. It's typical Corinthian, Roman Corinthian order, and there, again, this combination of rather formal elements. Very fond of using these tripartite windows in this period, although they don't really have any precedent in antiquity. Here's the side view of the building, as you see this like typical running from the mill. Now, the American Renaissance was actually probably, although started by the Boston Public Library in about 1888 by McKinley and White, it was actually given great impetus by the Chicago Exposition of 1893, the Chicago Fair. That was supposed to have been held in 1892 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America. We're about to look forward to the 500th anniversary, as you know, in 1992. But this was done under the influence of Eastern architects
had all more or less converted to the American Renaissance. And so all the buildings, and it made a tremendous impression on American public who visited. The buildings were almost all, not quite all, almost all white, stucco. You know, they weren't they were almost all, again I have to correct myself, but they were almost all temporary buildings and disappeared after the run of the fair. This is the administration building, which was designed by Hunt, who was sort of this eldest great architect, really the dean of American architects at that period. And it was rather Frenchish. And some of them were somewhat Italian, but basically we could lump them all together as American Renaissance. But there was a lagoon, and there were ornamental bridges, and there were even gondolas, Venetian sailors pulled along the lagoon, and there were electric lights. So you know, it was great, marvelous, new experience, and a lot of white sculpture stuck around everywhere. Triumphal columns and so forth, and galleries, and other things. This sculpture, this is some kind of a man of war, an antique man of war. You've got a few wild animals around too. It must have been, in fact it was so, the whole thing was formally laid out and planned, and McKim was one of the major group of architects, as well as Daniel Burnham of Chicago, and they were the ones responsible for this general design. This is the Agriculture Building, which was the building designed by McKim, Mead and White. And it has a little Pantheon-like dome, great spread of facade, and very handsome. It was a typical building, and that is the spirit of there's a detail looking right at the front of it. I did see a very distinguished and, by and large, correctly Roman character. Though I don't suppose any Roman building, in fact I know, never had quite so many openings around the side, though the windows above the first cornice line maybe is slightly Roman, but the rest of it, all that openness wouldn't have been Roman. They were not trying to be archaeological. They wanted to have a dignified and impressive. They did succeed in getting rid of all the whimsy and perhaps some of the pleasure of the Queen Anne. There's another building of the fair with towers, a little bit Spanish-like in that respect, and that's the way it was. The colonnade now. Oh, sorry, I jumped fairs. I'm getting out of line with my mind. Actually, in 1905, Oregon had its own fair, that is the Lewis and Clark Exposition Fair, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark Expedition. And it was located in some made land, northwest Portland, and there is, I'll show you a number of the buildings because it's clearly the reflection of the work of the Chicago Fair. The architects in charge were Whitten and Lewis. Ian Lewis, I believe, was the principal designing partner and supervisor general the fair, although he didn't do all the buildings, but generally overlooked them and saw that there was, on the whole, a certain consistency. This is the colonnade, and this is the main entrance and the government building. That is the center of the thing. Well, there are, I'm going to go rather rapidly through this. That is the main entrance, and then we get to this building, which is the Oriental Exhibits Building. Well, nothing very Oriental about it. But it is, in fact, rather a bit suggestive of Spanish colonial, as it was to become known later on. That's a curious thing in my mind that suggests the way it was. And here, another building. This one is the manufacturers and liberal arts, varied industries, as it is said, kind of a little bit more mission-like. These were all wrote up for 1905. And then we have some rather blank buildings. The mining building, as you see here, Underwood said that is very severe. And And some of the photographs are all were taken before there was any landscaping around. This is the auditorium, a festival hall. And then, among some of the smaller buildings, there were things like this. This is the Missouri State Building. Rather domestic in scale, although it does have a ponderous dome, and for a house that is a ponderous dome. I don't know if these are all lath and plaster. I do say this building, the states were represented, and they had exhibits of their products, and they also had places for the natives or the descendants of natives to meet in them, and so they were quite an important part of the fair. I have one slide of one of the interior. This is the Underwood typewriter booth, which is perhaps, it's figured itself, kind of a Frenchified version of an exhibition booth. This is obviously the Colorado building, and the American Inn. Oh no, this got it fixed up here. This is the American Inn. Now that was built for the fair to accommodate the visitors. The fair was a great success. And one of the last successes, I suppose, of that kind of thing. The Chicago has been a great success. And this is like a resort hotel could have been built in Massachusetts and Maine in the later part of the 19th century. And this is a barrack-like building, but accommodation for the visitors, of which there were a great many. Well, there was one building that was different, and that was the Forestry Building, which was the only one, not quite, but basically the only one that survived in situ at any rate, from the time of the Lewis and Clark Exposition. It was destroyed by fire in 1964. And this is what you see here. We don't have very good colored slides, unfortunately, but that gives you an idea. It is on the idea almost, the kind of thing that later on might be categorized as national park style, the gigantic log structure. And it was made with very large scale tree trunks. And it was designed by, perhaps by A. Doyle, working for I.M. Lewis in this particular case. It stood and it was preserved because it was unusual, you know. And anyway, I suppose it was a little bit more solid construction than the lath and plaster Renaissance example. There's nothing Renaissance about this. It's very American and very woodsy, and perhaps very appropriately, northwestern. This is an interior view. It's like a forest tree. I never got in it. I suppose I didn't really try when I first was out here. And we have, I had a colored slide of this too. There's an end of it. No, probably not. Okay, that's the type of building that it was, and it was too bad that it burned and things up in 1964. Well, this rather charming little building was moved to the site called the Colony by Eric Glass, and this was called the Lincoln House. And it really was built for the Lewis and Clark Exposition. It was the State of Illinois building, and it was based on a house President Abraham Lincoln had in Springfield, Illinois. And it's, of course, going back to, classic revival, very simple. It was bracketed, very simple. And unfortunately, it was later on. Well, there's the slide. I'm sorry I didn't get that around here. There it is later. Burned, part damaged. I don't think anything's left of it, but maybe somebody knows better. If you do, tell me. Well, there's one other building that was moved, and it is a house. And it was from the Lewis and Clark Exposition, and it's in pretty good shape. See, this is known as the Dagger House, and it is on Overlook Terrace in northeastern part of Portland, 4036 Overlook Terrace, if you're interested. And it was the Massachusetts State Building at the Lewis and Clark Exposition. It was moved to this site, crowded in somewhat by an unfortunate bungalow there. But now, this is clearly what the Colonial Revival meant. The Lincoln House perhaps not, because it was really based on, it was imitation of an actual classic revival house in Illinois. And the Colonial Revival was like this with rather pretentious columns and that sort of thing. There's a corner of it so you can see the detail, especially of the entablature, which is a full-scale entablature, and quite a majestic building. Now that's appropriately enough a way to get into the Colonial Revival. In most ways, I think that the Colonial Revival can be considered as the domestic counterpart of the American Renaissance. I can see now how lucky I am in getting tied together. We're going back a little to the 90s because that's really when it started, the Colonial. This one is perhaps not Colonial Revival. It is, however, by Woodburn and Lewis of 1892 in Portland, the Theodore Wilcox House. And it is maybe partly Richardsonian, but as you see, maybe partly Queen Anne. The kind of thing, but rather cooled down and simple. And here is the Milton Smith House of 1891. Some people think it might be later than that. It's been faded. But it's either very early in the 90s or toward the end of the 90s. And that is Colonial Revival, beyond doubt. That's not Richardsonian, and it's not Queen Anne. And that's Woodburn and Lewis. And that is, let's see what, like this is a view of it from below. It's on Curry, I think, the southwest Curry. Anyway, this is the source for the Colonial Revival. This is the Taylor House, the H.A.C. Taylor House of 1886 in Newport, Rhode Island, by McKim, and White. And that is generally considered to be one of the first, if not the very first, Colonial Revival house in America. And you see that that's just approximately the same time that they were doing the designs for the Boston Public Library. There's every reason to think that the public building would be American Renaissance and this thing would be Colonial Revival. No colonial building would have ever looked like this. First of all, its bulk, size, its volume, quite different. And then it has almost too many bits and pieces of colonial design. Dormers, porches, chimneys, little balustrated walk at the top, and various kinds of windows. Grouped windows, a Palladian window. Well, no colonial house ever had so many Palladian windows. And triple windows up there. And the triple windows with these little swags over them. That's Colonial Revival. And we get it, it's very handsome, but you get it all loaded down. And it's like balloons, which has been blown out, and the Colonial is filling it out. It's from every place. It's not just from one part of the Colonial, it's from all of them. That's the plan of it, to show you certain other features I don't have time to go into. Probably need to be focused. But the plan has, as you see, a terrace around it, and a veranda coming up to the corridor, and then coming around the corridor. And then it has a very wide hall in relation to the rest of the house, with a big open stair. Can we focus that at all? And there's the library. There's the library. Was there? Parlor, dining room, study. And they're all connected by sliding doors. Except for the fact that the rooms are all now regular, it's like the Richardsonian houses with big openings and a lot of space and a big central hall. But there are no bumps and lumps. It doesn't burst out. It is contained within the regular balanced
form, symmetrical form, in fact, with these chimneys, 4 great chimneys going up through the roof, a very high hipped roof. And that's, well, that's the spirit of the Colonial Revival, and that's what you're going to see here. This is another house in Portland, but they're all smaller. They're not all smaller, but it happens that they are. This is the house on Southwest King, which is really the same design as the Smith House. And it's Whitman Lewis, and it probably dates from the 90s, about the same time. This one is another house on Southwest King. This is called the Mackenzie House, 1893, Whitman Lewis. And you see it has a regular balance section. It has coining, it's wood, timber, porch, like a porch, the typical, like the Osborne house, or the Taylor house rather, in Newport. And then the spirit of it is somewhat like the colonial houses in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on Brattle Street, for example. And here is another one on Southwest King, and this is the Mechanic House, which is, I think, in my opinion, somewhat nicer. 3 stories, and it has been repainted since this photograph was taken, and I noticed like it as well. But it's like a number of houses on Brattle Street in Cambridge. It's very conservative, and the porticos are modest. As you can see, there's a sort of plaster strip coining here. Those are nice examples of the 1890s for the Colonial Revival. This is, one of the famous houses in Cambridge on Brattle Street. The Longfellow, the vassal Longfellow house, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow lived in it. And I'll show you because I have a slide that reveals the general characteristics. Yellow and white. Those, in the late 19th century, people believed that was the way the colonial buildings had been painted. That wasn't necessarily true. And the State House in Boston was originally red brick, white trim by Bullfinch, but by this time it had been painted with yellow. And when they added a big annex to it, by McKim white in the late 19th century, they made it in yellow brick. So now, of course, that the front's been peeled off, it's red again, you get a mixture of not very happily composed elements. But yellow was thought of as really the color. And I must say that in Cambridge, it's very popular, very nice, especially in lilac time when there are a great many lilacs and they grew against yellow buildings like this. There's still some on the campus of Harvard. And this is the middle 18th century. Well, now, I'm going to go through some of these pretty rapidly because there are a great many houses around Portland and some places elsewhere of the Colonial Revival. And most of them are Wyndham Lewis, the good ones. This is Wyndham Lewis. On the left, it is the Iceland White House on 20th and Everett. And on the right here, it is the Irish Shea House by Wyndham Lewis, another view. Shallow, segmental bay. Now, I mentioned about the whole treatment of bays. Now, we've gone in the Roman Anne, Richardsonian, and the Queen Anne, the bays came sticking out just wherever they wanted them. But in the Colonial Revival, you have them symmetrically placed balance, you see, on each side, and they don't sprawl out around the perimeter of the house, and they are just proper bays projecting from rooms and not big tumors, as it were, sticking out of the house itself, as they were in some of the Richardsonian or Queen Anne houses. And here's another one. This is the Richard Curler House by Wyndham Lewis of the late 19th, maybe early 20th century. I would say this, again, conservative with a modest porch, 3 stories with shutters. The windows tend to be rather big no matter where, and that is not true of the colonial house.
and group that is real colonial houses. That's one way you can tell the Colonial Revival. And you group windows like this kind of thing. This house, I think, is gone, and maybe I could be wrong, I've never seen it, if it is there, of 1902. It was the Dr. William Jones house in Portland, and by Wyndham and Lewis. And you can see, it tends to be, these are rather, or sober, the last one. You see, this is, it goes up, and it's a big, bulky form. And I must say that the bay got pretty dangerously close to the corner there. But here it is with the portico, the White House. You notice the White House originally didn't have those big porticos. They were added after the original design. And they belong to the classic revival period. Well, anyway, you can see fancy terraces, porches, the dormers, which are ornamented like that. That's a pretty good idea of the Colonial Revival. Well, there are lots of houses like this. This is another one. This is the Bates Cellar House of 1908. And I think maybe I have another slide of it. Maybe I didn't. No. This is still another one. This is the Jocelyn House. And this is Wyndham and Lewis design. No, beg your pardon. By Louis Thompson, who was another architect, not so well known, but who did much the same thing. As I said, this is I forget what that one is. I mean, I had it down there probably wrong. It was in the wrong order. Another Wyndham and Lewis house, though. What did you see? This kind of thing is, I did get some of these houses out of order, I guess. The houses, they're so much alike in a way, and yet they're not exactly alike. And the two-story porticos, and then sometimes introduced the secondary porch. Well, this is the Honeymoon House. This Honeymoon House is on Prospect, and it was designed by Lewis, not Iron Lewis, Wyndham Lewis, but David Lewis, who designed quite a few houses in this style at the same time, about in the first decade of the century. And here is a house in Medford. I think maybe it's been destroyed now. It's called the Butler House of 1905 in Medford, just to show you the spread of these things. Well, this belongs to the Portland one, so maybe I'll get back in order in a minute. Well, here is an apartment house, a Colonial Revival apartment house. And it is a type of apartment house which was to go on being built for quite a long time. That is, 3 floors usually, entrance through a central hall, and apartments on each side. These apartments are on Southwest 11th Avenue in Portland. So, this is in Southern Oregon too. This is the main example of a Colonial Revival house in Southern Oregon. It's the Swedenborg House in Ashland, and it was built in 1904 to 1905. The photographs are a little bit washed out. There's a detail on the back, and actually there are quite a lot of informal features, but basically it's meant to be a formal, balanced house. Well, just to show you, sometimes there were other things in the Colonial Revival. It's sort of amusing to find this. This is a house not a house actually. It is a little opera house. It was built 1895 to 1900. It was moved in 1918, and it is, of all places, in the small town of Weston in northeastern Oregon. An example of public rather than private Colonial Revival. And there is another house, the Hood River, which is sort of in between, which probably comes from the early 1900s. But Mackenzie, who took the slide, thought that the owner told it was 1890s. I don't believe that's true. Well, I believe that sort of finishes the Colonial Revival for us now. get into something else, yeah. Now, we've got to start on the Queen Anne. Beg your pardon, we are in the Queen Anne here, but we're going to start on the bungalows. But in order to get that background, it seems to me that, as the more I've thought about it, that the American bungalow style and combined with the craftsman form was an effort to have a new architecture. They weren't so consciously trying to do it as perhaps they were in Europe, but to have belongs to the general period of what I call the New Art movements. And those are represented by the arts and crafts movement in England, and by the Art Nouveau in Belgium and France, by the Secession in Vienna, by the Stile Floreale in Italy, by the Jugendstil in Germany and Switzerland, and then, of course, in America, by the bungalow craftsmen. So I'm going to go back to the arts and crafts movement. It's constructive to see these two examples because they're both in the same district. They're both in Bedford Park. And they both date from the 1890s. And so it is really rather remarkable to see this house, the J.W. Forster House, which is over there on the left, of 1891. And oh, it's on the right, I'm sorry. I think I didn't get this the right order. That's why things are sort of confused. This is in Bedford Park, and that's a typical red brick house in Bedford Park, you see. And it's about the same time in the 1890s. Now, that is clearly Queen Anne. Well, no, this is the arts and crafts movement by perhaps its most distinguished architect in England, Charles Francis Annesley Boise. And this was done in 1891. It had a rather reasonable price. It cost a little less than £500, although that was more money then than it is now. And so it is, of course, brick, but covered with stucco, and has roof windows, but there are stone sills and so forth. And then instead of the fancy sort of Dutch gables, it has overhanging eaves supported on very delicate iron brackets, and the chimney just an elegant paper. It's a marvelous little house, of course, and it's so difficult from the other. Well, this is This is another design by Boise, very closely timed to the Forster House. This is also 1891, but it is in London itself. It is in the part of London called West Kensington, and it's called the Studio. And it was built for an artist. It's at the corner of the street, and here are conventional row houses. And this little house stuck in the corner, and you see it's similar. It is rough cast stucco. The roof is supported by delicate iron roof. The chimney is papered. Altogether, a very handsome, small house. And that is carried on by Boise. He was, I think, the principal arts and crafts architect, that is, who wasn't influenced too much by the medieval, and he grew out of that and the Queen Anne. This is his house. It's a house designed by him on Lake Windermere in the Lake District in Lancashire. It's called Broadleaf, and it dates from 1899. This is all the same. Stucco also, a big roof on it, and it's a simple treatment of stone around the entrance. And here is detail of that. Notice the bracketed supports for the eaves. The bay is stone. There are no heavy frames around the windows. It's simple. And then there's this little oval window here. There are two bays, actually. The oval window comes in between. It's not very easy to get a photograph of this house from the front or from this side because the ground drops right down to Lake Windermere. And I didn't get down there to take it. There's the entranceway, which is sort of on the uphill side, and you come into this courtyard, and it's a little bit more, maybe more picturesque. It's slate with a little entrance here. But it's a rough cast stucco, with flat stones around, and then sort of simple, massive chimneys. These are very good examples of Voysey's particular style, and he did quite a lot. And later on, I would point out that his influence was felt in this country. In fact, the old college side building by Mr. Wilcox was indeed influenced by Voysey.